Hello everyone! In this video we are going to take a first look at oTree. We are going to look at the different files and folders in an oTree project, and we're going to try to get an overview what we can do in each of these files. To do this, we are going to use the new oTree format that was introduced in early 2021. So if you have worked with oTree before, or if you find older oTree projects on the web that you want to modify, things might look a little bit different. But don't worry, most of the things are the same. And I'm also going to have a video in which I explain the differences between the old and the new format. I've opened an oTree project here in PyCharm, so let's look at what we see. First of all, we have this folder called oTree course. This is my PyCharm project, so this was created by my PyCharm development environment and has nothing to do with oTree. It's just the folder in which I put my oTree project. Then we have this other folder that I also named oTree course in here, and this is my oTree project. So if you remember the last video, this is what you start by using the oTree start project and then the project name command. Inside this folder, we have one important file that is the settings.py file. And inside this file, we can make some configurations that are valid for the entire project. And we also have an app folder. So I have one app right now. This app is called Overview app. But each oTree project can contain many different apps. So the project is kind of a container for your different apps. And the apps are where you actually are going to write your experiment. And you can use one app for one experiment, but you could also use multiple apps in one experiment. For example, if you have an experiment where people first want to do a prisoner's dilemma, and then they need to work on a real effort task, you could implement all of this using just one app, but you could also make a separate app, one for each, so the prisoner's dilemma and the real effort task. And the good thing about that is that you can reuse oTree apps. So let's say you want to reuse your real effort task later on in a different project. You can just add this app to the other project as well, and then you can reuse your task. So in general, a good rule is that if you have separate parts of the experiment that you might want to reuse again, or where you might want to reuse parts again, it makes sense to put them in different apps. So now that we have a view of the structure, let's look into our first app. Inside our overview app here, we have 3 files and 2 different types of files. So we have an init.py file, and in this file we are going to write the background logic of our oTree code, and it's going to be written in Python. And then we have 2 HTML files, and these HTML files are going to be used to design the user interface, and each page has an HTML file. So as you can see here, we already have 2 HTML files. One is called my page HTML and one is called results. So we have a page where the participant does something, and then we have a second page where they can see the results. So let's look at the init.py file in a bit more detail. Inside this init.py file, we have all the Python code that we want to use in our oTree project. And we have 2 different types of things here. First of all, we have 4 things that are called models, which are constants, subsession, group, and player. And then below, you can have we have one class here for each page. As you can see, this is class name myPage, and this corresponds to this myPage HTML. And here we have the class results. This corresponds to this results HTML. So for every page that the subjects see, we need one of these Python classes here and a corresponding HTML file. So let's look at the models in a little bit more detail. The models are used to store information that we're going to use on our pages and in the background. And first of all, we have the constants. In the constants, you can just write normal Python variables. And I have a quick overview here of what kind of variables you have. Here we have strings. We can have an empty variable that is set to none. We can have integers, booleans, lists, and we have an oTree currency variable. So by using cu and then a number, you create a currency variable in oTree, and currency is what you use for the payments for the subject. And by using this oTree currency method, you can automatically convert between an experimental currency that you might define and actual real-world money. But yeah, you can define any kind of Python data type in here, and then we can interact with these data in different parts of our experiment. And then, in addition to the constants, we have 3 more models. 2 of them we are going to ignore for now. So let's look at the player models in more detail. In the player models, we store information that is supposed to go into our database. So everything that we want to analyze later on, that we want to see when we download our results from our experiment after we've run it, needs to be stored in the database using these models fields. And we have different types of models fields. We have the Boolean field, which can be used for binary variables. So for example, if you have an variable whether the subject is in the treatment group or the control group, you could use this Boolean field here and set this to true if the subject is in the treatment group. Then we have string fields that we are using for short text. For example, if you want to assign a random ID to the subject, or you're going to use an online service like mturk or Prolific and you want to record the ID that subjects have on these servers in order to make sure that you can pay them, you're going to use a string field for that. Then we have the long string field, which is very similar to the normal string field, but as the comment here says, it's meant for longer text, and this has two implications. First of all, there's a limit on how long the text that you can store on a normal string field can be. So if you want your subjects to write an essay, for example, it might be just too much text to be stored in the string field. And the second difference is also how this looks by default if you display it to the subject. So by default, if you display a string field to the subjects and you want them to enter a string, it will be just like a short input field. And if you use a long string field, it will be a larger text box where you have multiple lines and can write more text. Then we have integer fields that are used to be storing whole numbers, or integers. Float fields that we use to store decimal numbers. And again, currency fields that correspond to this oTree currency type, where you can store payoff of subjects. And in addition to that, subjects also have a hidden currency field that is just called payoff. So if you just need one field where you store the payoff, you don't need to create a different currency field here and call it earnings or something like that. You can assume that there already exists a field that is called payoff and it equals a models.currency field. That's always there and you don't need to define it. So, and let's quickly go back to these two things, the group and the subsession. Those work exactly the same as the player's model. So you can, everything that you can store in here in the player's model, you can also store here and here. The difference is just the level. So if you have a multiplayer experiment with different groups, let's say a prisoner's dilemma where two people form a group and play against each other, then they share the group. So if you store something in the player, that's separate for each player. If you store something in the group, that's something that is shared among the group. So you might, for example, in the public goods game, you might want to store the total contribution of the group to the public good, and then you would use a group field. And in the subsession class, you store something that is the same on the entire subsession levels. And the subsession is usually when you create one session on oTree, then for each round it creates one subsession. So this would be shared among all the players that are currently playing your experiment in the round. And you might want to store something like treatment information in there. So if you set different treatments and the treatments are the same for one session, then you could store this in a subsession field. So this is a quick overview over the models. And now let's quickly jump into pages. But before we do that, I'm going to these things quite fast right now, and they might be a little bit overwhelming. That's not an issue. We are going to look at everything in more detail when we learn more about oTree and when we develop our experiments. I just wanted to start this off with a quick overview over everything, so that you have an idea about what you can do with oTree and how you do things in oTree. So we have this page here, and inside this page, first of all, we have form model and we have form fields. And the form model corresponds to one of these three models in here. And this basically says the information that the player enters on this page is supposed to be stored here in the player model. It could also be that the player enters information that is relevant to the entire group, and then it might be stored here in the group model. So if we want to set a field that is defined here, we use group here. And then down here, we just enter the fields that are entered on this page. So in this case, it's the feedback and the number option chosen field. Those two fields are going to be set by the user. So they're going to input something and we're going to store it on this page. And the other fields are maybe either set on other pages or we set them internally in the background in our Python code. But every field that we want to have user input for needs to be put in here. On top of this information about which kind of input we want from the player, there are three functions that we can define inside of each of these pages. The first one is the isDisplayed function, and this function just decides whether the page is displayed in a given round or not, because we might have some pages, like an instruction page, for example, that is only displayed in one round, or it might only be displayed in certain treatments. So here we can control whether a subject is supposed to see a page or not. We have the before next page function that does exactly what it says. So after the player clicks the next button on a page, but before they reach the next page, this code is run, and we can, for example, use this to interact with the input we just gotten. So we could check whether the subject made a correct answer and then give them a payoff if they made a correct answer. Or here I just set their payoff to 2 regardless of what they do. And we have the vars for template function. Again, we can run Python code in here, and here we can also pass things from the Python code to the templates where subjects see it. For example, if we want to display them a completion code that we generate here, we can use this return here to path it to the page, and then here in our results page we could display it, for example. Yeah. So then the results page is the second page, and I just left this empty for now. And if you leave it empty, you just have to have this path here to tell Python that you didn't leave this empty by accident. You actually didn't want to write anything here. And we don't always have to write something here. So if you just want to display a text, then you can just edit the template file and leave the Python code completely empty. Okay, now that we have an overview over Python, let's quickly look into the mypage.html file. And so what we do here is we write HTML code. So if you ever worked with websites or have done some web development, you might be familiar with some of these things. So down here, I just put some HTML code, for example, to write a table. But there's also something that is special about oTree, and that is generally the things that are in these kind of tags, so either double curly brackets or curly bracket %sign. And the first thing I want to mention here is the form fields. So by using this tag, it automatically generates input fields for all the forms we defined here. So if we write form fields here, and in here in our Python code we define number option chosen and feedback, there will be an input field for number option chosen and an input field for feedback. Above that, I have a comment, so this is not displayed. This is just for you to remind yourself what you're doing in your code. And there are two ways to write this comment. This way is the oTree way, kind of, with these tags and comment and end comment. But since we are using HTML, we can also just use the way that comments are written in HTML, which is this way with these arrows. Then the next thing is we have a completion code here that we want to display. And if you remember, we passed this here from the vars for template function and set it to this JH and something else. So when subjects see this page, they're going to see completion code, :JH, and so on. So they're not going to see this curly brackets and the completion code. In here, they're going to see whatever we pass from the Python function. So with these double curly brackets, we can access the information that we gotten from the Python function. And in addition to using anything that we passed in the vars for template function, we can also directly access the constants and the player. So for example, here, the base payment was set in the constants class over here to be one currency unit. And by using double curly brackets and then constants.basePayment, I can directly display whatever the base payment is. And because it's formatted as a currency, this will read base payment is 1 point or $1, depending on whether you want to use points or real currency. And below that, we can just write a simple text. So any text that we write in here is going to be displayed. So here, this line is just going to read hello world, and nothing's going to change because we are not using any oTree variables in this line. And finally, down here, we have the next button. This is just a button to get the subject to the next page. And we can also have some CSS styling to style our table. We are going to learn more about styling later on, but if you are familiar with web design already, then you might already know how this works. Okay, then let's jump into the settings file. So this was the app. Now we are going out of the app again. We're going to our project into the settings file. And here we can do some things that apply to the entire project. And the most important thing that we need to do here is we need to define sessions. So by just adding an app, we do not make it available to people to play. For every app that we add here, we need to define at least one session in which we want to use it. So as you can see, I have this overview app and I defined a session here that I named overview app. Then I gave the display name overview app, so this is what you're going to see if you open your oTree project in the web browser. And I defined the app sequence, and for now it just contains the overview app. But I could, let's say if I had the overview app and I had another app, that is a prisoner's dilemma, I could just type comma here and then prisoner's dilemma. And then it would display first my overview app and then my prisoner's dilemma. And I can have multiple sessions in which I combine these apps in different orders. I could have another session where the prisoner's dilemma comes first and then the overview app. I could have another session where I just use the prisoner's dilemma. So every session that we define here has to contain one app, but it can contain as many apps as we want. So that is all for the coding side of things. But before we end this video, let's take a quick look at the oTree admin interface in the web browser. And to do this, we need to start a server. So we first open our terminal, and then we need to check that we are in the right directory, and we need to be in this folder here in the oTree project folder. And right now we are in this folder, in the PyCharm project folder. So we need to change the directory with the cd command, cd oTree course. So we need to, when you cd, you need to enter whatever you named your oTree project here on this level. And now we can start a development server using the oTree dev server command. And it says that the server started and we should open our browser at localhost. So let's do that. Okay, now we have opened our oTree project in our browser by navigating to localhost /8000. And let's have a look at what we see. First of all, we are in the demo view right now, and here we can start test sessions for our project. So let me just do this, and we end up here. On this page, we can see the links with which we can start the experiment. And we either have this link, which is a general one, where we just, the first time we click on it, we're going to be assigned to be participant 1. The second time we click on it, we're going to be assigned to be participant 2. But we also have participant-specific links. So if we want to make sure that a specific person ends up being participant 3, we can send this specific link. Then what else can we do here? We can monitor what the participants are doing currently. And once we start, we're going to see that participant 1 has started and on which page participant 1 is currently. We can look at our data. We can look at payments. And we can read a description again about our app. So let's start and click one of these links. We end up on the My page, and as you can see, we have the 2 input fields in here that we defined, the feedback and the number option chosen field. We just enter something here because oTree won't let us get to the next page without having entered something here. And we also see the other things that we define on this page, so the completion code, the payment, everything is there. And we can go to the next page. Now we are on the results page, and here we see nothing except a placeholder for the page title because we didn't define anything. Now if we go back to the session now and go to the monitor tab again, we can see that participant 1 has started and is currently on page 2 of 2, which is the results page, and has been there for 1 minute. So we can use this to monitor our sessions and also check how long people have been on pages and whether they have finished. And we can also see the data, and then here we can see a preview that the feedback and the enter was SA and the number of option I chose was 2. So here we can see all the data that the subjects have entered already, and this is updated automatically, but we can also refresh it by using this button down here. Okay, this is a test session, but if we want to actually collect data, we should use the session command here and create a real session by clicking this, and then we can enter how many participants we want. We can choose which of the sessions we want to start. Right now we have only defined 1. And we can also configure this session. So for example, we can change the participation fee, which is internally what oTree uses as a base payment for the subjects. And when I create this, I get a session with 50 links that is set up for 50 participants. And the reason why we want to do that rather than demo sessions is if I click on sessions again, I see my active sessions, so I can go back to them anytime. And with the demo session, once I close this view, once I open it, I have this session view. But once I do something else, this demo view is wrong. Is gone, and I cannot get back to it. So that's why we want to use sessions in productions. Rooms we are going to ignore for now because we're going to have a video on that later on. And in the data tab, we can download the data in different formats, so in Excel optimized or a plain CSV, and we can download it for all apps or just separate per app. Right now we only have one app, so there's not too much of a difference, but we could have different apps and then we could download the data separately. And oTree also automatically records the time that subjects spent on the pages. And then finally we have a server check that just tells us whether our server is ready for production. And right now it tells us that we have the debug mode on and we have no password protection. So there are just some warnings that we should make some changes before we actually deploy this experiment and use it to collect live data. But for testing, we can ignore these things because we don't need a password to test. So this was an overview of oTree. I hope you have a general idea about how oTree works right now. And we're going to start to step by step learn about how we can develop experiments in oTree in the next video.